So in these next couple of sections, we're going to trace that thread like we talked about earlier, and we're going to walk through each redemptive era and talk about what worship of God looked like during that time. So a redemptive era is basically a time in the history of God's people where he interacted with them in a particular way. So as we go through these, I'll identify which sections of the Bible I'm talking about. So the first redemptive era that we're going to talk about is Genesis and Exodus, and we're going to call this one Revelation and Redemption, the means of acceptable worship. So what did worship look like during this time? Israel's relationship was not to be at the level of the mysterious and the irrational. They were to enjoy personal and moral fellowship with the one who made a covenant to be their God, which is even more important in light of their context. The nations around them were certainly engaging in worship of other little g gods, but their systems and practices were mysterious and irrational because they were created by man. The Lord revealed himself through the removal of the Israelites from Egypt, showed himself to them through the Ten Commandments, and thus showed them how to love and honor him as a response to those things. In various ways, the Bible makes it plain that worship is acceptable to God only if it is based on a true knowledge of God and of his will. Worship outside of this framework is idolatrous. If you don't truly know God by the words that he has said, you can't truly worship him. That is made clear from the very beginning of the Bible, as we see here. The next redemptive era we're going to talk about is worship through the sacrificial system. So think specifically the books of Deuteronomy and Leviticus here. At the heart of the covenant God made with Israel was the assurance that they would be his people and he would be their God. So this was the foundation for all the laws of the sacrificial system. In this time, the Israelites' place of worship was the tabernacle. The tabernacle was significant because God's continuing presence with them was to be proclaimed and expressed by this tent sanctuary. There were 3 courts, the outer, inner, and holy of holies, which reflected the holiness of God who dwelt in Israel's midst. It was a very tangible term that the tabernacle expressed the truth that human beings could not come into the presence on their own terms. At the root of it, the whole system was designed to keep a sinful people in a relationship with the holy God. Another component important to this era is the priesthood. They were the ones who facilitated many aspects of the sacrificial system. The priests did not derive their authority and function from the community, but from God, who set them apart to be his servants. So, as an aside, that brings a lot of meaning to this section way later on in the Bible, in 1 Peter 2, where Christians are called a royal priesthood. In the new covenant, we take on this legacy of set-apartness and intercession to God. Also in this redemptive era, we read a lot about festivals. Festivals were created as another means of acknowledgement of God's faithfulness. They were a way to celebrate and remember all that God had done for his people. Some really important things to remember, though, that we can tend to lose sight of as we look back on this era in retrospect. We tend to view the sacrificial system as probably burdensome, dark, and maybe don't even think about it as worship necessarily. But for the people of Israel, these acts were full of thanksgiving, celebration, and praise. The people in Old Testament times were not wholly occupied with the business of atonement for sins, or they didn't regard their worship as a somber and dreary necessity. For them, it was a joy to be in a relationship with God. The last redemptive era we're going to talk about in the Old Testament is the temple and sacrifice in prophetic times. So in many ways, the temple was like the tabernacle. It was where God dwelled with his people. However, because of its permanence, it's an actual building, not a tent, it signified that there was a future for Israel as the people of God, because the building itself expressed the continuation of God's covenant promise to be with them and bless them. At the same time, you have the prophets proclaiming the word of the Lord and prophecies of a new and better temple that would ultimately be fulfilled by the sovereign work of God in a future time. Okay, so that's probably a lot of info, but it helps us to know where worship has come from and how it's evolved as God's relationship with his people has changed. In the next video, we'll take a look at worship in the New Testament.